My name is Brad Pitt, and I'm 73 years old. I've lived long enough to know that the moment you think you understand your life, that's usually when it completely falls apart around you. 7 months ago, I sat at my son's dinner table for what I thought was just another family gathering. I was wrong. That night, sitting in a room full of the people I love most in this world, I discovered the most devastating truth I could have learned. I had already been replaced. I had already been written out of the story. And the worst part wasn't the replacement itself. It was how long everyone had been keeping this from me, pretending everything was normal when nothing had been normal for a very long time. Let me start at the beginning, not the dinner table that comes later. Let me start with who I was before everything changed. I'm a retired architect. Or rather, I spent 42 years building things and designing buildings before I handed over my drafting table and walked away from the office on a Tuesday afternoon in June 2018. I was 65 years old. I'd spent 4 decades sketching lines on paper and then watching those lines become real. Hospitals, office buildings, shopping centers, a few homes that I was particularly proud of. There's something about architecture that suited me. It required precision, planning, and the ability to see the world not as it was, but as it could be. It required patience, because good buildings take years to complete. And it required an acceptance that you might not see the final product in its complete form. You draw the plans, you oversee the construction, and then you walk away and let others live in your creation. I didn't realize until much later how much of my personality had become tied to that profession. I had become a man of measurements and angles. I had become someone who thought in terms of blueprints and long-term planning. I had become someone who could take feedback without taking it personally, or so I thought. What I had actually become was someone who was very, very good at not being present in the moment. I was always thinking about what came next, always measuring, always calculating, always planning ahead for problems that hadn't arrived yet. My wife Margaret used to joke about this when we were younger. "Brad," she'd say, touching my arm while I was reading the newspaper, "you're not in this room right now. You're already at work, already thinking about the Morrison building." She was right. I was always there but never quite present. That was a flaw I recognized but never corrected. Looking back now, I wonder if that single character trait, this inability to be fully present, was the root of everything that happened. Margaret and I got married in 1973. I was 24 years old, fresh out of architecture school, full of dreams about what I was going to build and what kind of life we were going to create together. She was 22, beautiful in a way that made you forget to think about architecture for a few seconds, which was unusual for me. We had 3 children together: David, my oldest, born in 1974, Sarah, born in 1977, and Michael, born in 1981. I love all 3 of them. I want to say that clearly now because everything I'm about to tell you is going to make it sound like I didn't, or that they didn't deserve my love. But I loved them. I love them still. What happened wasn't about lack of love. It was about something far more complicated and far more human than that. David was always the golden child. This isn't me being bitter. This is just a fact that everyone in the family acknowledged without ever saying it out loud. He was charismatic, charming, athletic, and effortlessly good at things that came naturally to other people. He played football in high school and was actually quite good. He got decent grades without seeming to try. Girls liked him. Teachers liked him. Even his siblings liked him, which is not always easy for an older child to achieve. When David walked into a room, things happened. Energy shifted. Conversations got more animated. He had that quality that you can't teach and can't fake. He had presence. Sarah, my daughter, was different. She was quieter, more introspective, more like me in some ways. She was thoughtful and careful. She studied hard not because she was naturally brilliant, but because she cared about doing things right. She was the kind of child who would finish her homework before dinner and then volunteer to help with the dishes. She played violin, not very well, but with genuine passion. She wanted to be a therapist, I remember. That was her dream around age 14 or 15. She cared deeply about other people's problems. She had empathy in a way that David didn't quite possess. David was friendly, but Sarah was kind. There's a difference. And then there was Michael, the surprise. Margaret got pregnant with Michael when David was already in college and Sarah was a junior in high school. We hadn't planned it. We were happy to have him, but the timing meant that Michael grew up with very different siblings than David and Sarah had grown up with. By the time Michael was old enough to really know his older siblings, David was already gone, off to college, and then to his first job. Michael became something of an afterthought in some ways. Not unloved, but not the center of attention the way David had been. Here's the thing about being the father of someone like David. It's easy to not notice the others. When you have a son who lights up every room he walks into, who has friends constantly calling the house, who scores touchdowns that make the Friday night sports section of the newspaper, it's very easy to not notice your other children sitting quietly in their rooms, doing their homework, practicing their instrument, asking you questions that you answer while still reading the newspaper. I did that. I did that constantly. I was present in the house, but absent from their lives in ways that I'm only starting to understand now. What I'm trying to say is this: I was a good provider. I made good money. I ensured that my children went to good schools. I paid for their college educations. I drove them to soccer practice and school events when asked. I was the kind of father who did the right things but didn't always understand why the right things mattered. I was mechanical about it. I checked boxes. I saw parenting the way I saw architecture, as a problem to be solved with the proper planning and execution. What I didn't understand was that parenting, like love itself, requires you to be present in ways that architecture never demands. But this isn't a story about my failures as a father, though there are plenty of those woven through everything that happened. This is a story about being replaced. This is a story about what it means to discover that someone has decided you're no longer necessary, and that everyone you love has simply accepted that decision without telling you. Let me tell you about the dinner. That's where this story truly begins, even though the roots go back much further. It was a Saturday in late September. David called me on Friday and asked if Margaret and I wanted to come to dinner at his house. He and his wife, Patricia, live in a beautiful home about 40 minutes away from Margaret and me. We live in the same small town that we've lived in for 50 years now. Our house is paid off. It's a nice house. I designed it myself, actually, back in 1985. It's a bit dated now, but it's solid. Good bones, as they say in the real estate business. "Come at 6, David said on the phone. "Patricia is making her pot roast. You know how good her pot roast is." I didn't know, actually. Or rather, I had tasted Patricia's pot roast before, but I couldn't remember it specifically. This is the kind of detail that matters more than I realized at the time. I should have remembered my daughter-in-law's signature dish. A good father would have remembered, but I had always been more focused on the main event than on the preparation. I had always been more focused on what was coming next than on what was happening right now. "We'll be there," I told David. "What should I bring?" "Nothing," he said. "Just bring yourself." Margaret was excited. She always was when it came to family gatherings. Margaret had continued to do the work of holding our family together long after I had stopped trying. She called our children regularly. She remembered their birthdays. She asked about their lives. She was the kind of wife who had made a marriage work despite being married to a man who was often somewhere else, even when he was standing in the same room. We drove over on Saturday evening. The sun was still high in the sky, that particular quality of early autumn light that makes everything look like it's been painted with gold. I remember noticing this because I was a trained observer of light and space. It was part of my professional DNA. I remember thinking about how David had positioned his house relative to the setting sun, whether he'd thought about the angle of the western light coming through his dining room windows. These were the kinds of things I thought about. When we arrived at the house, Sarah was already there. This surprised me. Sarah lived 2 states away in Boston, where she worked as a therapist at a private practice. She didn't come home often. The last time I had seen her in person was maybe 18 months ago at Christmas 2 years prior. We video called occasionally, but these were usually brief, perfunctory conversations. She'd ask how I was doing, I'd give her a 3-sentence update. She'd say she had to go, and that would be that. So seeing her standing in David's kitchen was unusual enough that I commented on it. "Sarah, I didn't know you were coming," I said, moving in to give her a hug. She hugged me back, but it was the kind of hug that doesn't quite reach the person. You know the kind I'm talking about. It's a hug that says, "I'm doing this because it's what's expected, not because I genuinely want to." I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Or maybe I did, but I didn't want to acknowledge what it meant. "Hi, Dad," she said. "Yeah, I decided to come for the weekend. It's been a while." It had been longer than a while, but I didn't say that. I was already uncomfortable in my own skin. I had never been good at small talk with my own children. This is another thing I'm saying clearly now. I was terrible at it. I could talk to clients about their building needs for hours. I could discuss the intricacies of structural design with other architects until well past midnight. But with my own family, I became monosyllabic and distant. I became the man reading the newspaper, while my wife tried to get me to engage. Michael was there too, of course. Michael was 39 years old now, living nearby with his wife, Jennifer, and their 2 teenage children. Michael had always been the most distant of my 3 children, in the sense that there was never quite the same bond that I had with David or, in a different way, with Sarah. This wasn't Michael's fault. This was a product of timing and personality and all the small choices I made over the years that added up to a certain kind of relationship. Patricia had made not just pot roast but a whole meal, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, a salad with homemade dressing. The dining room table was set nicely. There were cloth napkins. Margaret complimented Patricia on the spread, and Patricia beamed. This is something I understand now that I didn't understand then. My wife was always the one doing the emotional labor. She was always the one making people feel seen and appreciated. She was always the one who understood that acknowledging someone's effort matters. We sat down to eat. Everything was normal at first. We talked about small things. The weather had been nice. How were the grandchildren doing? Michael's kids were excelling in school. David and Patricia had just taken a vacation to Florida. Margaret asked everyone questions and actually listened to the answers. I mostly ate and nodded at appropriate moments. It was during the main course that I first noticed something was different. I was midway through a piece of pot roast when the conversation shifted. David made a comment about some decision he'd made at work. He's a corporate lawyer, by the way, which I always found amusing given that his childhood involved watching me draw buildings. Patricia laughed at the comment, and then Sarah smiled. Michael said something that made them all laugh again. And then David said something else, and as he said it, I noticed that everyone's eyes shifted away from me. Not obviously, just slightly. A small shift in attention that shouldn't have meant anything but did. I wasn't part of the joke, I realized. I hadn't been part of the conversation that led up to the joke. My children were talking to each other and I was just there. I was sitting at the table, but I wasn't actually part of the gathering. It was like watching a film of your own life. You're in it, but you're not really in it. This might not sound like much to you, and maybe it isn't. Maybe I was being oversensitive. But I had lived 73 years on this earth, and I suddenly, vividly understood something that had been true for a long time. My own children didn't really know me. And more than that, I wasn't sure they actually wanted to. The conversation moved on. We finished the pot roast. Patricia brought out dessert, homemade apple pie with vanilla ice cream. It was good. Margaret said it was delicious. David agreed. Michael asked for seconds. And somewhere between the first and second course of dessert, the conversation shifted again, and this time it became something I've replayed in my mind hundreds of times since that evening. David was talking about a decision he had made, some business matter. He was explaining his reasoning to the rest of the table. "The thing is," he said, "I realized I had to do what was best for my family, not what everyone else expected me to do. I had to draw a line and I had to stick to it." Sarah was nodding. Patricia was listening intently. Margaret was eating her pie, and I remember thinking for just a moment that she didn't look surprised by what David was saying. She looked like someone who had heard this before. Michael leaned forward slightly. "That takes guts," he said. "A lot of people wouldn't have the courage to do that." "I had good examples," David said, and then he paused. He looked at me very briefly, not directly at me but in my direction, and then he looked away. "And bad ones." I set down my fork. I had been about to take another bite of pie, but I set it down instead. The sound it made against the plate seemed very loud. "What does that mean?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to me, like I was hearing it from a distance. "Nothing," David said. "I'm just saying that sometimes you learn from people what you want to do, and sometimes you learn what you don't want to do." "Are you talking about me?" I asked. "Dad," Sarah said softly. It was the first time she had spoken directly to me since we'd arrived. "Can we not do this?" "Do what?" I asked. "I'm just asking if my own son is talking about me being a bad example." "Nobody said you were a bad example," Patricia said. She meant well. I could see that she was trying to smooth over an awkward moment. "David's just talking about his own journey." But David was looking at me now, and his expression was different. It was like someone had taken off a mask. It was softer but also colder somehow, more honest. "Yeah, Dad, I was talking about you. Or not about you specifically. About the kind of father who focuses on everything except the people he's supposed to be taking care of." The fork stayed on the plate. I looked at Margaret. She wasn't looking at me. She was very intently focused on her pie, cutting a piece with the edge of her fork, not meeting my eyes. "I don't think this is the time," Michael said, but he said it quietly. He said it the way you'd say something when you already know it's not going to work, when you already know the train is leaving the station and your words won't stop it. "When is the time?" David asked. He wasn't angry, which made it worse somehow. He was calm. He was serious. He was the way he had always been: controlled, measured, thoughtful. "I'm 49 years old, and I've spent my whole life waiting for the right time to talk to my father about the fact that he was never really present for me. Is there a right time, or should I just keep waiting?" I didn't know what to say. This was a conversation I hadn't prepared for, and I'm someone who prepares for things. I'm someone who plans ahead, who thinks about contingencies, who considers the angles. I didn't have a prepared response to being told by my own son that I had failed him in the most fundamental way. "That's not fair," I said, and immediately I knew it was the wrong thing to say. "I provided for you. "You provided for us," David interrupted. "You gave us a house and food and an education, but you weren't here, not really. You were always somewhere else. Even when you were physically present, you were mentally somewhere else. You were thinking about work or the next project or the next thing. You weren't actually with us." Sarah was staring at her plate. Michael was looking out the window. Patricia was looking at David with something like pride. And Margaret still wasn't looking at me. "I did the best I could," I said. It was a weak thing to say, and I knew it even as I said it. "Maybe," David said, "but your best wasn't very good." And I've spent the last few years realizing that I don't have to keep waiting for you to understand what you did wrong. I've realized that I can just accept that this is how it's going to be and move on. It's hard to explain what happened in that moment. It was like a glass of water tipping over in slow motion. I could see it happening, but I couldn't stop it. I could see my son was saying something that had been building for a long time, and I knew that I was supposed to respond in some way, but I couldn't figure out what the right response was. I couldn't figure out how to fix this, the way I had always been able to fix architectural problems. There was no blueprint for this conversation. "I think you should probably go," David said after a long silence. His voice was quiet, but there was something final about it. "I don't think this is working." "Go?" I asked, even though I understood exactly what he meant. "It's only 8 o'clock." "I don't think you should be here," David said simply. "I don't think it's healthy for me to be around you right now, maybe not for a while." I looked at Sarah. She was finally looking at me, but her expression was sad, resigned, like she had expected this to happen but was sorry that it had to. Michael was still looking out the window. Patricia had her hand on David's arm and her expression had softened. She looked at me with what I can only describe as pity. Margaret stood up. "Let's go," she said to me quietly. "Margaret," I started. "Let's go," she said again, and there was something in her voice that made me realize that she had known this was coming. She had known that this conversation was going to happen, and she had come anyway. She had come and listened to her husband be told by his son that he had failed, and she had said nothing. She had not defended me. She had not spoken up. She had just sat there, eating her pie, not meeting my eyes. We drove home in silence. I remember the sound of the car tires on the road. I remember the streetlights passing. I remember thinking about the quality of light, about how the darkness at 9 o'clock in September was different from the darkness at 9 o'clock in December. I remember my hands gripping the steering wheel very tightly. When we got home, Margaret went straight upstairs to bed. I sat in the living room for a long time, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to understand how a dinner invitation could turn into a confrontation that felt like it had been building for years, trying to understand how my own son could look at me with that expression of cold disappointment. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room and replayed the conversation over and over in my mind. I tried to figure out where it had gone wrong. I tried to figure out what I should have said instead. I tried to figure out how I could fix this. But underneath all of that, something else was happening, something much darker and much more devastating. Underneath all of that thinking, I was slowly coming to a realization that wouldn't fully form until much later, but was beginning to crystallize in my mind that very night. This wasn't about what had just happened at dinner. This was about something that had been happening for a very long time. This was about a decision that had been made, a choice that had been created, a story that had been written without me. Over the next few days, I tried to make contact with David. I called his office. His secretary told me he was in a meeting. I called his cell phone. He didn't pick up. I sent him an email trying to explain myself, trying to say that I understood his point, that I wanted to talk about it more. He didn't respond. I called again 3 days later. This time he picked up. "Dad," he said, "I'm not ready to talk about this." "I'm sorry," I said. "For whatever I did, for however I made you feel, I'm sorry. I was doing the best I could with the knowledge I had at the time." "That's just it," he said. "You've had 73 years to figure this out, and you're still doing your best with the knowledge you have. That's not good enough anymore." The line went quiet. I heard him breathing on the other end. "I think we need some space," he said finally. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm just trying to protect myself." "From what?" I asked. "From your own father." "Yes," he said, and then he hung up. I tried calling back, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried a few more times over the next week, with the same result. By the 10th call, I realized that his voicemail was probably full. I realized that he might have blocked my number. I reached out to Sarah. I sent her an email. For 3 weeks she didn't respond. Then finally I got a reply. It was brief. "Hi Dad," it said. "I'm not ready to talk about this either right now. I think David is right that you need to understand something about how your choices affected us. But I'm also not ready to be the messenger. I'm sorry. I need some time to process all of this. Love, Sarah." Love, Sarah. Those 2 words at the end of that email, they should have comforted me. But instead, they felt like a goodbye. Michael, I didn't call. I wasn't sure what to say to Michael or what he would say to me. We had never had the easiest relationship, and I didn't want to make things worse. But about a week after the dinner, he called me. "Hey, Dad," he said. "I just wanted to check in with you." I appreciated the call. I think he knew that I needed it. "I'm okay," I lied. "How are you?" "I'm good. Jennifer and the kids are good. Look, I just want to say something, and I hope you won't take it the wrong way." "Okay," I said carefully. "What David said at dinner. I think he was right about some things. I think he wasn't right about everything, but I think he was right about the main thing, which is that you were never really present when we were kids. You were there, but you weren't there. And I think that affected all of us in different ways. I waited for him to continue. But I also want to say that I understand why you were like that. I understand that you were working hard to provide for us. I understand that you were doing what you thought you were supposed to do. I don't hate you for it or anything. I just think you need to understand that there's a cost to that. There's a cost to not being present, and we paid that cost. Michael, I started. Let me finish, he said. I'm saying this because I don't think David will talk to you right now, and I don't think Sarah is ready to. But I want you to know that you have the chance to understand this. You have the chance to actually be present now if you want to be. And I think that would be good for everyone. It was a kindness, what Michael said. It was more kindness than I probably deserved. And it was the most direct conversation I had ever had with my youngest son. Thank you, I said. I'm sorry that I wasn't there the way I should have been. Yeah, he said. Well, there's nothing you can do about that now, but maybe there's something you can do going forward. We talked for a few more minutes and then he said he had to go. Before he hung up, he said, "Take care of yourself, Dad, and maybe talk to someone about this. A therapist or something. I think that would help." After he hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand, trying to understand what had just happened. My youngest son had given me permission to grieve. He had acknowledged that I had done something wrong, but he had also indicated that it wasn't too late to try to fix it. It was the most hope I had felt since the dinner. But underneath that hope, there was something else growing. There was a realization that was slowly becoming clearer and clearer with each passing day. There was a truth that I was beginning to understand, even though I didn't want to accept it. Margaret knew. Margaret had known this was coming, and she hadn't warned me. She hadn't prepared me. She had just let it happen. I brought this up with her one night after dinner, about 2 weeks after the disastrous gathering at David's house. We were sitting in the living room, the way we usually did after dinner. Margaret was reading a book. I was ostensibly reading the newspaper, but I wasn't really paying attention to it. "Did you know?" I asked. Margaret looked up from her book. "Did I know what?" "That David was planning to say those things at dinner. Did you know he was angry with me?" She set her book down carefully on her lap. "Yes," she said simply. I waited for her to elaborate, but she didn't. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because David asked me not to," she said. "He needed to say these things to you himself, and he needed to do it without you already being on your guard. So you came to dinner knowing that he was going to attack me, and you said nothing." "He didn't attack you," Margaret said. "He told you the truth. There's a difference." I felt something crystallize in me then. It was anger, but it was also something else. It was the realization that my wife had made a choice. She had chosen to side with my son against me, without even giving me the courtesy of a warning. She had sat at that table and eaten her pie and pretended that everything was normal, when she had known the whole time that it wasn't. "You should have told me," I said. "Why?" Margaret asked. She wasn't being mean. She was genuinely asking the question. "So you could have prepared a defense. So you could have come ready to deny everything he was going to say. That wouldn't have helped anyone, Brad. David needed to have that conversation with you, and he needed to have it without you already having your shield up." "He's my son," I said. "I deserve to know that he was angry with me." "He's also my son," Margaret said. "And he was drowning. He was trying to have a real relationship with you, and it was failing, and he was drowning in his own disappointment. So yes, I chose to help him. I chose to let him do what he needed to do, and I would make the same choice again." I didn't say anything after that. I couldn't. There was nothing to say. Margaret had just told me that her loyalty to our son superseded her loyalty to me. She had just told me that in a conflict between her husband and her child, she would choose the child. And now I was understanding what David had said at dinner, The thing he had said that had made everyone turn away from me. He had said something about drawing a line. He had said something about doing what was best for his family, instead of what everyone expected him to do. I was beginning to understand what that line was. I was beginning to understand that I was on the other side of that line. Over the next few months, I tried to piece together what had happened. I tried to understand the timeline of when this shift had occurred. I talked to Michael a few more times on the phone, carefully, trying not to put him in the position of having to choose sides. From these conversations, I started to understand the larger picture. Apparently, David had been talking to a therapist for several years. He had been working through his childhood, his relationship with me, his feelings about how I had parented him. At some point, he had decided that his mental health depended on him setting boundaries with me. That was the line he had drawn. His therapist, from what I could gather, had encouraged him to confront me with the reality of how my absence had affected him. And David, being the kind of person who commits fully to things he believes in, had decided to do that at what he thought would be a family dinner. Sarah, meanwhile, had her own issues. She had spent her entire childhood trying to get my attention, and when that didn't work, she had simply stopped trying. She had become the kind of person who worked hard and did things right and never asked for help or attention, because she had learned very early that asking didn't work. My lack of attention had shaped her into someone who expected rejection, who preemptively isolated herself before anyone else could isolate her. Her therapy had apparently involved realizing that she needed to accept David's boundaries and stop trying to be the mediator between him and me. Michael, the youngest, had his own complicated relationship with this. He loved me, I think, but he was also the product of a household where his father had already been checked out by the time he was born. Michael had grown up with a father who was present but distant, and he had learned to not expect very much from me. He was, in his way, the least damaged by my absence, perhaps because he had never expected much to begin with. And Margaret had been holding this family together for 50 years. She had been the emotional support for all three children. She had been the one who remembered their birthdays and their interests and their fears. And at some point, she had realized that I was never going to change, that I was never going to be the kind of man who was fully present, who understood the importance of attention and connection. And instead of continuing to try to make it work, she had made a choice. She had decided to protect her children from my emotional absence in the only way she knew how, by letting them set boundaries with me and then supporting those boundaries. None of this was explained to me directly. I had to piece it together like a puzzle, one conversation at a time, and the picture that emerged was devastating in its clarity. It was the picture of a man who had been so focused on building buildings and planning for the future that he had completely failed to build a meaningful relationship with his own children. It was the picture of a family that had simply moved on without him. By November of that year, about 2 months after the dinner, I realized that David was not going to unblock objectively my number. Sarah had not responded to any of my emails for 6 weeks. Michael was still willing to talk to me on the phone, but only briefly, and only out of a sense of obligation. Margaret was treating me like a housemate rather than a husband, polite, cordial, but distant. She had moved her things to the guest room. She said it was because she wasn't sleeping well and didn't want to disturb me, but I understood the truth underneath that excuse. She was no longer willing to share a bed with me. This is when things started to shift in my mind. This is when I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a family conflict that could be resolved with the right apology or the right gesture. I was dealing with a fundamental truth. I had been replaced, not by another person exactly, but by the absence of me. My role in this family had been filled by the space where I was supposed to be. My children had learned to live without me, and they had discovered that they preferred it that way. For the first time in my life, I understood something about architecture that I had spent 42 years of my professional life avoiding. I understood that a building is not just what you build. A building is also defined by what you leave empty. The spaces matter. The absences matter. And if those absences are never filled, if those spaces are never occupied the way they were supposed to be, then the building becomes something other than what was designed. It becomes something unstable, something that can eventually collapse. I had been the missing space in my family's design, and they had adapted to that absence. They had rebuilt around it. And now, even if I wanted to fill that space, the structure had already been altered. The family had learned to exist without me, and the shape of that existence had become set. I didn't tell anyone what I was thinking. I didn't tell Margaret that I understood what was happening. I didn't try to contact David again. I didn't send more emails to Sarah. I simply accepted it. I accepted that my role had changed. I accepted that I was now a guest in my own family, welcomed at formal gatherings only out of a sense of obligation or routine. And then, in December, about 3 months after the dinner, something happened that would change everything again. Margaret's mother had a stroke. Margaret's mother, whose name was Eleanor, lived about an hour away, in a nursing home. She was 93 years old and she had been declining for several years. She had Alzheimer's, which had progressed to the point where she no longer really recognized anyone, including Margaret. But the stroke was sudden and severe, and Margaret got a call from the nursing home telling her that Eleanor had been taken to the hospital and might not make it. I drove Margaret to the hospital. We didn't talk much on the way. When we arrived, we found that Eleanor had suffered a massive stroke that had affected the right side of her brain. She was alive, but she was not responsive. She was not going to get better. The doctors gave her perhaps a week, maybe less. Margaret sat by her mother's bedside and held her hand. She talked to Eleanor, even though Eleanor couldn't hear her. She told her stories about when Eleanor was young, about how she used to take Margaret to the park and push her on the swing. She cried quietly, her hand never leaving her mother's. David and Sarah came to the hospital, both of them. It was the first time I had seen them since the dinner 3 months before. Sarah hugged her mother and her grandmother in that order. David sat down across from me without acknowledging me and read his book quietly. They both stayed for several hours, taking turns sitting with Eleanor, and I sat there in the background the way I had always done. Eleanor died on the 4th day. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and Margaret was there. She called me from the hospital and told me that her mother was gone. I got out of bed. I was sleeping in the guest room by then, in the space my wife had created for me, and drove to the hospital. Margaret was sitting in Eleanor's room, still holding her hand. She wasn't crying. She looked almost peaceful, the way people sometimes do when they've been waiting for something to happen for a long time and it's finally over. "I'm here," I said, and I sat down next to my wife of 50 years. The funeral was on a cold Saturday in December. The church was full. Eleanor had been a beloved member of her community. She had volunteered at the library for 20 years. She had been active in her church. She had lived a full life, and people came to celebrate that life. All 3 of my children came. All 3 of their spouses came. The grandchildren came. It was, in many ways, a proper family gathering. We sat together in the pews. We listened to the priest speak about Eleanor's life and her legacy. We stood up when we were supposed to stand up. We sat down when we were supposed to sit down. We even processed through the church in a way that might have looked, from the outside, like a normal family. But I was not part of that family. I was sitting next to it, but I was not really part of it. David would not look at me. Sarah spoke to me only when she had to. Michael was kind, as he always was, but there was a distance there, a careful politeness that made it clear that we were not as close as we might have been. Margaret, meanwhile, was the center of everyone's attention. David held her arm as we walked to the cemetery. Sarah brought her tissues and water. Michael helped her with her coat, and I stood to the side and watched my wife being cared for by our children, understanding in that moment with absolute clarity what I had lost. After the funeral, after we had taken Eleanor's grave and people had begun to disperse, Margaret told me that David wanted to talk to me. This surprised me. I had not expected David to speak to me, let alone to seek me out. We stood to the side of the cemetery, away from the crowd. Margaret excused herself to give us privacy, and David and I were left alone for the first time in 3 months. "I wanted to say something," David said. He was holding himself carefully, the way you do when you're trying to deliver difficult information. "Mom's been through a lot, with her mother and everything. I don't want her to have to worry about what's happening between us and you, so I want to make a proposal." I waited for him to continue. "I think we should talk," he said. "You and me. Not at dinner, not with the whole family, just us. Because I think there are things that need to be said, and I want to give you a chance to understand what those things are." It was not a warm invitation, but it was an invitation. It was the first real indication since the dinner that David was willing to acknowledge that I existed and might be worth talking to. "Okay," I said. "When?" "After the holidays," he said. "I don't want to deal with it right now with everything that's happening, but after the new year, we can schedule something." "Okay," I said again. "In the meantime, I think you should go to therapy," David said. "I think you should try to understand what Mom and all of us have been trying to tell you, and I think you should come to that conversation ready to listen instead of ready to defend yourself." "I can do that," I said. He nodded. "Okay then." That was our entire conversation, but it was more than I had gotten from David in 3 months, and I was grateful for it. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and I began the process of settling her mother's estate. There were lawyers involved and paperwork and decisions about what to do with Alina's house and her belongings. Margaret handled most of it, but I helped where I could. I organized documents. I made phone calls to insurance companies. I did the practical, mechanical things that had always been my strength. During this time, I made a decision. I called a therapist and made an appointment. Her name was Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, and she had an office about 15 minutes from my house. I had never been to therapy before. I had never seen the point in it. But now I understood that I didn't have a choice. I understood that if I wanted any kind of relationship with my family going forward, I had to do this work. My first appointment with Dr. Hartley was on January 7th, a Wednesday. I went in not knowing what to expect. Her office was warm and quiet, decorated with plants and soft lighting. She offered me tea, which I declined. She sat across from me in a comfortable chair and asked me why I was there. So I told her. I told her about the dinner and what David had said. I told her about how my children had all been in therapy themselves, working through their issues with me. I told her about how Margaret had moved to the guest room and how my entire family seemed to have moved on without me. I told her about the realization that I had been replaced by the absence of myself. Dr. Hartley listened. She didn't write anything down. She just listened with an expression of genuine interest and compassion on her face. When I finished, she asked me a question. "Do you think your children were wrong?" she asked. "Do you think they misunderstood what you were doing when you were focused on your work?" "I don't know," I said. It was the most honest thing I could say. "That's good," she said. "That's actually a very good place to start, because it means you're genuinely questioning your assumptions instead of defending them." We talked for the rest of the session. She asked me about my childhood. She asked me about my father and my mother and what it had been like growing up in my family. She asked me about the moment I decided to become an architect. She asked me about the first time I realized that my children felt neglected. This last question, I didn't have an answer for it. Or rather, I did, but I didn't want to face what that answer meant. "I think I always knew," I said finally. "I think I knew, and I just didn't want to admit it. Because if I admitted it, then I had to do something about it, and I didn't know what to do. So it was easier to pretend that the work I was doing was more important than the problem I was creating at home." "And was it?" Dr. Hartley asked. "Was the work more important?" I didn't answer right away. I sat with the question for a long moment. "No," I said. "No, it wasn't. Nothing was more important than being present with my children. but I made it more important because it was easier, because I knew how to do that. I didn't know how to be the kind of father that my children needed. And what kind of father did they need? Dr. Hartley asked. I thought about David, so hungry for approval that he had to leave the house and build an entirely separate life to find it. I thought about Sarah, so careful and so afraid of asking for anything, because she had learned that asking didn't work. I thought about Michael, so kind and so distant, the product of parents who were already burned out by the time he was born. They needed someone who was there, I said. They needed someone who was present, not just physically but emotionally. Someone who was interested in their lives, their thoughts, their feelings. Someone who remembered the things they told them. Someone who showed up. And that wasn't you, Dr. Hartley said. It wasn't a question. No, I said, that wasn't me. I went to therapy every week for the next 3 months. I spent each session examining my own history, my own failures, my own decisions to prioritize work over presence. I began to understand that my own father had been a distant man, that he had been focused on his career as a businessman and had largely left the emotional labor of parenting to my mother. And when she died, I was 16. He had simply been at a loss. He hadn't known how to be a father without her. So he had thrown himself into work even more, and I had watched that happen, and I had sworn that I would be different. But I hadn't been different. I had simply repeated the pattern that had been modeled for me. I also spent my therapy sessions working through shame. So much shame. Shame that I had missed important moments in my children's lives. Shame that I had prioritized abstract professional achievement over concrete human connection. Shame that I had let my wife do all the emotional work while I stood to the side, reading the newspaper. Shame that I had been so focused on building things that I had failed to build relationships. But gradually, with Dr. Hartley's help, I began to understand something important. Shame is not the same as regret. Shame is about you. It's about feeling bad about yourself. Regret is about recognizing that you've caused harm and committing to doing better. Shame is static. Regret can be transformative. I needed to move from shame to regret. I needed to stop feeling bad about myself and start focusing on what I could actually change. In late March, I sent David an email. I didn't try to explain myself. I didn't try to defend my actions. I simply said that I was beginning to understand what he had been trying to tell me, and that I wanted to meet with him and have that conversation he had proposed. David responded within a few days. He suggested a coffee shop downtown on a Saturday morning, April 5th. I marked it on my calendar. The week leading up to that meeting, I was nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous since I was a young man, fresh out of architecture school, about to show my designs to a real client for the first time. I was nervous because I knew that this conversation was going to require me to be vulnerable in ways that I had never been vulnerable before. I was nervous because I didn't know what David was going to say to me or whether I could actually listen to it the way I needed to listen. I met David at the coffee shop at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. He was already there, sitting at a small table by the window. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him. There was an empty chair across from him. I got myself a coffee and sat down. "Thanks for coming," David said. "Thanks for asking me," I replied. We sat in silence for a moment. The coffee shop was busy around us, people on laptops, friends meeting for breakfast, the general hum of commerce and connection happening all around us. "I've been in therapy for about 6 years now," David said finally. "I started because I was struggling with anxiety and some depression related to work. But pretty quickly, my therapist and I realized that a lot of what I was struggling with was rooted in childhood. Specifically, rooted in my relationship with you." I didn't interrupt him, I just listened. "The thing is," David continued, "I remember being a kid and feeling like if I was good at things, then you would notice me. If I played football, if I got good grades, if I was the kind of kid that made you proud, then maybe you would actually be present. Maybe you would actually come to my games and be interested in my life." He paused to take a sip of coffee. And you did come to some of my games, but you weren't really there. You would sit in the stands and read a book or think about whatever project you had going on at work. And I noticed. Kids notice that kind of thing. You think we don't know when our parents are checked out, but we do. We know. And it makes you feel like you're not interesting enough or good enough to hold their attention. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. I let him continue. So I just kept trying to be better. I kept trying to do things that would make you notice me. And when you didn't, I told myself that maybe the problem was that I wasn't trying hard enough. But then I realized in therapy that the problem wasn't with me. The problem was that you couldn't be present even if I was the most interesting kid in the world. Because presence wasn't something you were capable of. I'm sorry, I said. It was inadequate, but it was true. David held up his hand. Let me finish, he said. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying this because you asked me to explain and I want you to really understand. I nodded and stayed quiet. As I got older, I realized that I was recreating the same pattern in my own life. I was driven by the need for achievement and success. I became a lawyer because it was impressive and because it made me feel important. And then I almost repeated your pattern with my own kids because I was so focused on being successful that I wasn't actually present for them. This surprised me. David had never mentioned having issues with his own family. But I caught myself, he continued. I went to therapy and I realized what was happening, and I made a decision that I was going to be different. I was going to be present with my kids. I was going to show up. And in order to do that, I had to set boundaries with you because I realized that your emotional absence was affecting me so deeply that I couldn't be present for anyone else. What kind of boundaries? I asked. Boundaries where I protect my own mental health, he said. Which means I need to limit my contact with you. It means I need to make sure that our relationship doesn't pull me back into old patterns of trying to win your approval or deal with your disappointment. It sounded when he said it like that like a terrible thing, but I was beginning to understand that boundaries are not a rejection. They're a protection. They're a way of saying, I care about this relationship, but I care about myself more. I understand, I said. Do you? David asked. Because I need you to really understand this. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm not trying to punish you. I'm trying to be healthy, and that requires me to have distance from you. Okay, I said, how much distance? For now, I think we should probably see each other at family events. Christmas, that kind of thing. We can see each other, but I don't want to spend time together outside of those events. And I don't think we should have these deep, personal conversations right now. I think we need to have some space between us. It was not the outcome I had hoped for. I had hoped that David might begin to forgive me. I had hoped that this conversation might be the beginning of a restoration. Instead, it was the beginning of a managed, limited relationship. It was better than nothing, but it was much less than what I wanted. But I was beginning to understand that what I wanted wasn't really the point. The point was what David needed, and what David needed was space. I can accept that, I told him. Good, he said. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. I'm glad we had this conversation. It was helpful for me to say all of this out loud. We sat for a few more minutes and then David said he had to go. He had plans with his kids. As I watched him leave, I realized something. My son was a good father. He was the kind of father who showed up, who was present, who made his children a priority. And he had become that father not despite the absence I had modeled, but because of it. He had looked at what I did wrong and he had decided to do the opposite. That was small consolation, but it was something. Over the next few months, I settled into a new reality. I continued therapy with Dr. Hartley. I learned to be more present with Margaret, even though she maintained her distance in the bedroom. I found a hobby. I started drawing again, just for the sake of drawing, not to design buildings, but to record the world around me. I was learning, very slowly, what it might feel like to be present for the sake of presence itself, not for the sake of achievement or accomplishment. Sarah, surprisingly, reached out to me in May. She called one afternoon while I was in the garden, and I almost didn't recognize her voice at first. "Hi, Dad," she said. "I was wondering if maybe we could talk sometime." I said yes before she even finished the sentence. We set up a time to video call a few days later. When her face appeared on the screen, I was struck by how much she looked like her mother. I don't know why I was struck by this. I had known this for years. But there was something in that moment that made it clear to me, viscerally, that Sarah was a whole person with her own life and her own experiences, and I had spent so much of her childhood and young adulthood failing to see that. "I've been doing a lot of work in my own therapy," she said, "and I've realized that some of the ways I deal with stress and uncertainty are directly related to childhood patterns that developed in our family, specifically in my relationship with you." "I'm sorry," I said. "I know you are," Sarah replied. "I think you're genuinely starting to understand what happened, but I want you to understand from my perspective, not just from a place of general regret." So she told me about her childhood. She told me about feeling invisible. She told me about the time she got first chair in the school orchestra and nobody came to the concert except her mother. She told me about the time she won an academic award and her father was on a work trip and couldn't reschedule. "The worst part," she said, "wasn't that you weren't there. The worst part was that I could tell that you didn't realize how much it mattered to me. I could tell that you thought you had provided me with a good life, and that should have been enough. And I internalized that message. I internalized the idea that my emotional needs weren't as important as your professional success. And I spent my entire adulthood trying to be small and not need anything, because I had learned that needing things was a problem." She was crying as she said this, and I was crying too. But I didn't try to comfort her or defend myself. I just let her speak. "I became a therapist because I wanted to help people with the kind of pain that I felt but couldn't express," she continued. "And I'm good at my job. I help my clients every day. But I'm only able to help them because I understand that pain so deeply. And I understand it because of you, Dad. Because you taught me that I wasn't important enough to take your attention away from your work." "Sarah," I started. "Let me finish," she said. "I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying this because I need you to understand that there are consequences to these things. Real, lasting consequences. I'm 37 years old and I'm only just now in therapy, learning how to be comfortable with being the center of someone's attention. Do you understand how sad that is? Do you understand what you took from me?" "I do," I said. "I'm so sorry." "I know you are," she said again. "But I'm not ready to move past this yet. I think I will be, eventually. But right now, I'm still angry. I'm still grieving the relationship we could have had if you had been a different kind of man. And I don't think it's healthy for me to try to move past that anger before I've actually felt it." "Okay," I said. "So I'm going to keep some distance for a while," Sarah said. "But I wanted you to know that I'm not cutting you off permanently. I wanted you to know that I think you're capable of understanding this, and that makes me think there might be hope for us eventually. But I need you to be patient. I need you to accept that I'm not going to be available to you in the way you might want me to be." "I understand," I said. We talked for a few more minutes about lighter things, her practice, how her life in Boston was going, recommendations for restaurants in her neighborhood. And then she said she had to go. Before she hung up, she said, "I'm glad you're doing the work to understand this. It means something to me." After she hung up, I sat in the garden for a long time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. I thought about the time I had lost. I thought about the moments I had missed. I thought about the daughter I had never really known while she was growing up. I thought about the woman she had become despite me, not because of me. And I understood something very clearly in that moment. Understanding what I had done wrong would never make it right. Apologizing would never give my children back the presence they had needed and deserved. I couldn't fix what I had broken. I could only move forward and try to be different in whatever limited ways remained available to me. Margaret found me in the garden as the light was beginning to fade. She sat down next to me on the bench without saying anything. We sat together in silence, the way we had started 50 years ago, before I had learned to be absent even when I was present. "I've been thinking about getting an apartment," Margaret said after a while. This hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been thinking about moving out for a while," she said. "I've been doing some research on accessible apartments, places that I could afford with my share of the inheritance from my mother." Are you leaving me?" I asked. "I don't know," Margaret said. She sounded tired. "I don't think so, not permanently, but I think we need some space. I think I need some space. I've been holding this family together for 50 years and I'm tired. I'm very tired. And I think the best thing I can do, not just for me but for everyone, is to step back and let each person figure out their own relationship with you." "I don't understand," I said. "I know you don't," Margaret replied. "But it's true. I've been the bridge between you and our children. I've been the one who translates your love into a form that they can understand. And I've realized that by doing that, I've been enabling you to not grow. I've been allowing you to be present without being present, to love without showing up, to have a family without being part of it." "I'm trying to change," I said. "I know you are," Margaret said. "And I see that. But I think you need to change in a more fundamental way than you understand right now. And I think I'm in the way of that change. So I'm going to move out for a while and I'm going to see what happens." "For how long?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "A few months, maybe longer. Let's take it one day at a time." So Margaret got an apartment. She did it gradually, moving out slowly over the course of the next few weeks. She took some furniture, some of her clothes, some of her personal items. But she didn't take everything. She left her presence in the house, a toothbrush in the bathroom, some of her books on the shelves, a sweater hanging in the closet. The house felt enormous once she was gone. I walked through the rooms and realized how much of my wife's presence had been holding the space together. Without her, the house felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the physical objects inside it. I continued my therapy sessions. I continued to draw. I started volunteering at a community center, teaching basic architecture and design to teenagers. It wasn't much, but it was a way of giving back, a way of being present with people in a way that didn't require them to be my children or my wife. And slowly over the summer, something shifted in me. I wasn't waiting for forgiveness anymore. I was working on understanding. I wasn't trying to fix my family. I was trying to fix myself. There's a difference, and that difference is crucial. In August, my oldest grandson, David's son, turned 16. David invited me to his birthday party. It was the first family event I had been invited to since the funeral in December. I was nervous about going. I wasn't sure what to expect. I wasn't sure if I would be welcome. But I went. The party was held at David's house in the backyard. There was a tent set up, tables with food, a group of teenagers hanging out together. David greeted me when I arrived, and while he wasn't warm, he wasn't cold either. He was cordial. He was professional. He was the way you act towards someone you're trying to build a new relationship with from scratch. Sarah was there. She was helping Patricia set up the food. She didn't hug me, but she smiled at me when she saw me. It was a small smile, but it was a smile. Michael and his family were there. Michael gave me a bear hug the way he always did. His kids waved at me. Margaret was there too, which surprised me. She and David were talking together and they seemed comfortable with each other. I helped David set up some chairs and tables. We didn't talk much while we worked, but we were working together and that felt like progress. When everything was set up, David offered me a beer and I accepted it. We stood together, watching the teenagers play cornhole in the yard and didn't say very much. "How have you been?" David asked after a while. "Okay," I said. "Therapy is helping. I'm learning a lot about myself." "That's good," David said. "That's really good." We stood in silence for a moment. "I want you to know," David said, "that I see you trying. I see you doing the work, and I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm just trying to protect myself. But I do see what you're doing, and it means something." "Thank you," I said. I wanted to say more, but I didn't know what to say, so I left it there. Later, during the party, I found myself in a conversation with one of my grandsons. He was asking me about architecture, and I found myself actually enjoying the conversation, actually being interested in what he had to say. We talked for probably 45 minutes about buildings and design, and by the end of the conversation, I realized that I had been completely present. I hadn't thought about the next thing. I hadn't been distracted by something else. I had just been there with my grandson, talking about something we both found interesting. It was a small moment, but it was a moment of being present, and I had started to understand how rare and how valuable those moments are. At the end of the party, as I was preparing to leave, Margaret pulled me aside. We stood in the kitchen, away from the crowd. "I'm thinking about coming home," she said. "Not permanently, but for a few months to see how we do together." "Really?" I asked. I tried not to let too much hope into my voice. "Yes," Margaret said, "but I have conditions. I'm going to keep the apartment, so if things don't work, I can go back there. And I want to go to couples therapy with you. I want us to work on our relationship with someone who can help us." "Okay," I said, "whatever you need." "And you need to understand," Margaret said, "that this doesn't fix everything. This doesn't mean that everything is going to go back to the way it was before. Things have changed. I've changed. Our family has changed. We're all different people than we were a year ago." "I know," I said. "Do you?" Margaret asked. She was looking at me very carefully, the way she had looked at me on our wedding day, like she was trying to see all the way through me. "Because I need you to really understand that. I need you to understand that we can't go back. We can only go forward, and going forward is going to require work from you every single day. It's going to require you to be present even when you don't feel like it. It's going to require you to care about things that don't seem important to you, because they're important to the people you love." "I understand," I said. Margaret came home at the end of August. She brought her things back to the house, one bag at a time. We didn't immediately sleep in the same room. She took the guest bedroom and I took the master bedroom. But it was a start. We found a couples therapist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison, who specialized in helping long-term couples navigate serious conflict. Our first session was awkward and difficult. Dr. Morrison asked us to describe the current state of our relationship, and Margaret talked about feeling unseen and unheard for decades. She talked about the loneliness of being married to someone who was always somewhere else. She talked about the exhaustion of being the only one doing emotional work in the family. And I listened. I actually listened, without trying to defend myself or explain myself. I just listened to my wife of 50 years tell me that she had been lonely in our marriage, and I understood that I had been the cause of that loneliness. Over the next few months, Margaret and I worked on our relationship. We worked on communication. We worked on learning to be present with each other. We went on dates, actual dates, where we went out to dinner and talked to each other, not where we sat in comfortable silence reading the newspaper. We held hands. We learned to see each other again. It wasn't easy. There was still anger, still hurt, still the residue of decades of emotional distance. But there was also a willingness to try. There was also love underneath everything else, the kind of love that has been tested and survived. In November, as we approached Thanksgiving, David asked if we wanted to come to his house for the holiday. It would be the first time since the difficult dinner in September the year before. I was nervous, but I said yes. The dinner was different than any family dinner I had attended in years. There was less pretense. There was less trying to make everything perfect. We were just a group of people with a complicated history coming together to share a meal. David had cooked much of the food himself. Sarah had brought a salad. Michael had brought wine. Margaret brought a pecan pie that she had made, and I had brought myself, present and paying attention. During dinner, David made a toast. He talked about gratitude and family and the importance of showing up. And then he said something that made me understand that maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. "I'm grateful for my father," he said, "who has spent the last year trying to understand what he did wrong and what he needs to do differently. I'm grateful for his effort and his honesty. And I'm grateful that we're here together, even though the road to get here has been complicated and painful." He looked at me when he said this, and there was something in his expression that wasn't cold anymore. There was something softer there, something that looked like the beginning of forgiveness, or at least the beginning of the possibility of forgiveness. After dinner, as Margaret and I were preparing to leave, Sarah hugged me. It was a real hug, not the kind of hug where one person is doing all the work. It was a mutual hug, a hug that acknowledged that we both wanted the connection. "Thank you," she said, "for doing the work." "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm so sorry for what you missed." "I know," she said, "but maybe we can do better going forward." As we drove home, Margaret reached over and held my hand. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. We drove in silence, and it was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that was full of presence. I'm 75 years old now. It's been over a year since that first difficult dinner, almost 2 years since Margaret moved out of the house. The relationships in my family are still not perfect. David and I don't have the close relationship that we might have had if I had been a different kind of father. Sarah and I are still working through years of hurt and disappointment. Michael and I are rebuilding something that I had taken for granted. But we're doing the work. We're showing up. We're present with each other even when it's difficult. Margaret and I have moved forward in our relationship. She has officially given up the apartment. We sleep in the same bed again. But things are different than they were before. They're better in some ways because they're more honest. They're built on actual presence instead of comfortable habit. I'm still going to therapy with Dr. Hartley. I'm still teaching architecture to teenagers at the community center. I'm still drawing, not to design buildings, but to record the world around me. The way light falls, the way people hold themselves, the spaces between things. And I'm learning, every single day, what it means to be present. It's harder than I thought it would be. It's harder to care about other people's needs than it is to focus on your own work. It's harder to be interested in someone else's day than it is to think about what you need to accomplish. But it's also more rewarding. It's also more real. Let me tell you what I understand now that I didn't understand before. I understand that architecture is about more than buildings. It's about the spaces where people live their lives. It's about creating environments where human connection can happen. And I spent 42 years designing buildings and completely failed to design a home where my family could connect with each other. But here's the thing. It's not too late. It's never too late to start showing up. It's never too late to start being present. It might be too late to redo the past, but it's not too late to change the future. I won't get back the years I missed. I won't get to go back to David's football games and actually be there instead of reading about my building project. I won't get to go to Sarah's concerts and really listen to her play the violin. I won't get to be the father that Michael needed during the years when he was growing up with burned-out parents. But I can be present now. I can show up now. I can remember the things my grandchildren tell me. I can ask my children about their lives and actually listen to the answers. I can hold my wife's hand and mean it. This isn't a story about redemption in the Hollywood sense. This isn't a story about everything being fixed and everyone living happily ever after. This is a story about a man who spent most of his life absent even when he was present, who woke up one day and realized what he had lost, and who started, slowly and painfully, to build something real. This is a story about showing up. It's about understanding that presence is a choice, and that sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what matters. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in my story, I want to tell you something. Start now. Don't wait for a dinner where your family tells you that you've failed. Don't wait for your wife to move out. Don't wait for your children to cut you off. Start showing up now. Start being present now. Start caring about the people in front of you more than you care about your own achievements. You might think you have time. You might think that you can make it right later, that you can focus on work now and relationship later. But you can't. Relationships aren't something you can schedule for later. Presence isn't something you can catch up on. If you're not there, you're not there, and no amount of achievement is going to make up for that. I'm a man who spent 42 years building things. And the most important thing I ever built, my family, I left for someone else to maintain, and it deteriorated. And when I finally tried to fix it, I discovered that it was much harder to rebuild something than it would have been to maintain it in the first place. So start now. Be present now. Show up now. Look at the people in front of you and really see them. Listen to what they're telling you. Care about their lives more than you care about being right or being successful or being accomplished. Because in the end, nobody is going to remember the buildings you designed or the work you accomplished. They're going to remember whether you were there. They're going to remember whether you showed up. They're going to remember the presence or the absence. And right now, at 75 years old, I would trade every building I ever designed to get back the years I lost. But I can't do that. So instead, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be present with the people I love. And maybe, if I'm lucky, they'll let me. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the only thing that ever matters.